Welcome. You've clicked yourself onto Three Guys and an iPad, the only mortgage-focused podcast that remains ineligible for the COVID vaccine. I am one of your hosts, Brian Rieger of Content Beacon, but you're not here to see me today. You're here to see, at least in part, my good friend Rick Grant from Content Beacon, somewhere in northern Wisconsin. Rick, how are you today?
Doing good, Brian. We're thawing out, digging out. It's good to see you, though.
Like I said, this is what we call spring in our parts of the Midwest here, Rick. But speaking of that, we should probably bring in our third guy from Blustery. Yes, Blustery, I say, Austin, Texas. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kevin Breeland of Amplify Credit Union. Kevin, are you with us?
I am. I'm coming from the frozen tundra of Austin, Texas.
Outstanding.
Lambeau Field has nothing on us.
Probably not. And if you don't know Kevin lived in Alaska for some time, so he's just keeping an eye out for the polar bears at this point, I guess. It's nothing you haven't seen before, correct, Kevin?
That's right.
All right. Well, before we jump in, we've got two great guests here today. But before we jump in, this is the part where I do the shameless plug for Content Beacon, the premier B2B content marketing agency for the mortgage industry. So if you're a wholesaler trying to reach brokers, if you're a warehouse lender trying to reach correspondents, lender trying to reach realtors, you name it, we can help you out. Otherwise, if you have an idea for the show, if you'd like to speak on the show, or there's someone you'd like us to have on, as always, just email us, rick@contentbeacon.com or brian@contentbeacon.com. And enough of me. Let's get to our special guests. We are privileged to have two friends of the show along with us today. Our first is Mr. Trip Riley, partner with Saul Ewing, Ornstein & Lair out of Princeton, New Jersey. Trip, how are you today, sir?
One day is better than the rest.
Outstanding. And we're also thrilled to have with us today Loretta Salzano. She's a Loretta. She's a partner and president at Francis and Salzano in Norcross, Georgia. How are you today, Loretta?
I'm feeling groovy. Happy the sun is shining here in Atlanta.
Yeah, that may not last too much longer, but enjoy it while you can. Enjoy it. Well, let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to do a little talking. This is one of our early shows for 2021, and we're recording it in mid-February. You may see it a little bit after that. So I'm going to toss this one right out to our esteemed guests. We're about 2 months into 2021, and the conversation of last year at this time shifted pretty dramatically. We're not talking about refi anymore, and we're not talking about record hauls, although things are still going very well. And we're also talking about an industry that's anticipating a more aggressive enforcement environment. You've got the acting director at the CFPB calling out the mortgage servicing industry to a degree. We've heard some rumbles out there, so I'm going to turn it over to our two guests. Do you agree? Is this going to be a more aggressive enforcement environment over the next 12 months or so?
Well, I'll start if you don't mind, Loretta.
Yeah, sure. Why don't you go, and then Loretta, you hop right in behind.
Sure.
Look, I think that by all indications, it is going to be, they're anticipating, the Bureau is anticipating just as more aggressive oversight, investigation, and enforcement. And so let's look at the anecdotal evidence of that. What can't be any clearer. Yesterday, I think, or the day before yesterday, the acting director sort of sent out a help wanted ad and said, we want all of these new aggressive, consumer-oriented lawyers to come join us. That call was very reminiscent of the original call made when the Bureau was initially set up. So they wouldn't be doing that unless they thought they were going to ramp all aspects, research, and so forth, investigations and as I said, supervision and enforcement up. They just simply wouldn't call for that, even though we know that there's been a depletion of the staff there over the last 4 years. You also see the call of the acting director to be very cautious about how you are dealing with, as servicers, dealing with all things COVID, all things deferment, and how they're going to come out of that, and how are they going to appropriately, how they should appropriately address borrowers who've been impacted. I mean, there's many other ones, and I'm sure Loretta can talk about them. But that to me just indicates that it's not going to happen tomorrow. The light switch isn't going on tomorrow or the next week or even probably the next month. But I think if you were to look forward to the next 12 months, if we had this discussion 12 months from now, we will have seen greater supervision, greater research and results from that research, greater number of investigations, and a greater number of enforcement actions. The latter probably being low-hanging fruit, but we will see the increase of that.
Fantastic. Loretta,
Yeah.
for compliance officers coming?
Hell yes, right? Interestingly enough, I was speaking with a colleague last week who's in DC and who spends a lot of time defending institutions. And even before the change in administration, she said, even under the Trump administration, the CFPB dusted off a lot of files, and things that had been relatively dormant all bubbled up to the surface. And this is not just in the mortgage industry and other industries, but including in the mortgage industry. So that certainly is the beginning of the wave that is sure to crest. As Tripp said, there's been a call to arms for attorneys to come work for the CFPB. There's been public statements from the Biden administration about focus on racial equity, not just old school fair lending. The CFPB has come out with some guidance and guardrails for conducting business with people who have limited English proficiency, which again shows efforts to reach markets that before might have not been reached, or where there are challenges under ECOA and UDAP in doing business with folks who are non-English speakers. Maybe that's not as prescriptive as we like, but certainly it demonstrates that we're going to be seeing some attention to that. We know for sure that there will be heightened enforcement on fair lending. That's been relatively quiet. There have been some actions, of course, by the CFPB, but not the same attention as we had seen under Cordray's leadership. I know we're going to talk a little bit about servicing. That's going to be there. On things that are more mortgage focused, we've seen other regulators, especially the FDIC, really dig in on RESPA Section 8, kind of following the trend we'd seen from states. We heard from the CFPB with its FAQs that were issued in October. So it's possible that will get a little bit of attention. Unfortunately, I don't think the things that the mortgage industry is clamoring for attention, like changes to LO comp rule, are going to be high on the CFPB's list, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Well, Loretta and Tripp, we're going to come back to servicing. And of course, our new president only last night started to mention forbearances and foreclosures again. So we're going to talk about that. But I'd be remiss, both of you in the past have reminded me repeatedly that there's also 50 states out there that enforce more various regulations and laws as well. So anything we should be keeping an eye on with regard to the states?
Well, we know California, of course, they have their own mini CFPB, and I suspect we might see other states that do that. I'm trying to get centered here for you, Rick. Other states might do the same thing. I think that we've seen, obviously, over the years, attention to not just RESPA, as I mentioned, but licensing. And with COVID and so many people working at home, there's a huge push in the industry to loosen up branch licensure requirements and to allow remote working. So I think we'll see more attention to that, which is pro-industry. I think we'll also see more attention to issues that the CFPB takes the lead on, whether it's UDAPs related to advertisements or targeting certain groups, or looking at, for especially the states that have HMDA-like data collection rules, perhaps looking at how folks in protected classes are reached with new products and services or are not.
Yeah, I think that from within the mortgage industry, because there's a lot of focus by state AGs in other lending, consumer lending areas. But if we're focusing, as we are, simply on the mortgage industry, I think that while we've seen some activity at the state level with respect to all aspects of mortgage, I think the focus in the next year, 18 months, 2 years for the state will be twofold. One is going to be on marketing. I think that because of the economic straits that consumers are in, we were going to see mortgage lending, particularly by non-depository lenders, as well as fintech. It's almost as if we know they're going to focus on trying to help these consumers. And I say help, some are, some aren't. Maybe they're helping themselves to get through what's coming after the forbearance. So I think you're going to see a ton of marketing on radio and television and cable focused on those individuals at all age groups. And I think that the AGs will be of particular, have particular interest in that. And so if you are a lender and that's sort of your part of your strategic initiatives going forward into the new year and afterwards is to find a pipeline of business from those individuals, refinance, all kinds of different, mortgage and so forth, roll it all up. I think you better be careful about, the marketing aspect. And of course, there's a whole statute dealing with mortgage marketing that they're going to have to be aware of. But certainly for the state, who are be more nimble and have their ears to the ground in locales that the CFPB or FTC don't. And I think the next area is going to be cybersecurity, data protection. Again, from the state level, we certainly know that California and New York are, they're with their own regulations, they're heads and shoulders above most states with respect to that. But given that many lenders operate in different states, look to those two states as sort of the pole star of what you need to do. And it's not just complying and feeling like you're complying, like a soft feel that you're complying. You really need to have someone come in and audit that. And we just saw the other day, and I think I posted something on social media, that a vendor for a very large lender gets hacked, and maybe even an insurance company, I can't remember now, but the vendor. So you better be looking at your vendors as well, because certainly you can't point your finger at them and say, well, I thought that they had the right security, when I'm transferring data and they're storing it in the cloud, I thought it was okay. You can't just think it, you got to know it. So you got to have experts in there confirming.
What Tripp is saying about advertising, I think is right on. And we know that oftentimes the states take the lead from the CFPB, and considering our almost certain to be incoming director at the CFPB coming from the FTC, where there's so much focus on advertising anyway, and seeing just what the CFPB did under Trump's administration and all of the enforcement activity related to marketing of VA loans. I think that is, Tripp is spot on. It makes sense that we're going to see it from the states as well.
Wow. Amazing. And, as I alluded to before, guys, back to the federal level again here, and Tripp, you mentioned the vendors have to be on their toes as well. Well, the acting director at the CFPB specifically named one segment, called them out by name, the servicing industry. And now, as I mentioned before, the president has started to talk a little about forbearances and foreclosure. Kevin, I think you had a question for our guests in that regard.
Well, I think that, one of the things that concerns me, being an industry veteran on the origination side, not so much, on the backside of it, is, the whole adage of kicking the can down the road kind of thing, where forbearance and foreclosures have now been put off till June 30th of 2021. And one of the things that concerns me probably more than anything is it appears that, the mortgage industry's kind of been on a drunken stupor for the last 14 months, and COVID did nothing but, make all of us a lot of money. The reality of it is we've all been busy. But I'm very concerned about what the outcome's going to be when we get to the day that we finally have to start dealing with the foreclosures. Are there certain markets, for example, that you think you might see dropping housing prices because they're going to have more foreclosures per capita than, say, maybe could we see more foreclosures, for example, in an LA than maybe a Miami kind of thing? I mean, what do you think that's going to look like when we finally have to deal with that?
Well, let me start with the premise that I just read about either last night or this morning, which is that the risk of foreclosure coming out of these forbearances is less because the equity in the house, even in the housing of those people who have had to seek forbearance or got forbearance is great enough. We're not in 2008. We're not underwater. So when you come out of forbearance and you're delayed, I think what you're going to see, at least according to some of the anecdotal evidence regarding the values and the equity that is in these houses for even those people who are in forbearance, is another wave of refi, because they're going to have the equity. The companies are going to be willing to either modify the loans or refinance the loans, and they're going to be able to because there's equity in the house. So again, my point being is that potentially the risk that you're talking about of a lot of foreclosures may in fact be mollified to some extent, not completely, by the fact that we're not in 08 and so forth when everyone was underwater, and so there was no chance to refinance. But more pointedly, I think that even in the areas that were hardest hit, we're just not in 2008. I think that's the bottom line. Do I think there'll be foreclosures? There will be, because people are out of work and in fact may not want to even attempt to refinance or modify, and they'll walk away, or they'll sit in their homes because they don't have the money. They can't even afford a refi. Like, they can't make their payments. So if you can't make your payments at all, then there's no chance for refi. And I think Kevin, you're right. In those areas that were hardest hit, maybe South Central LA, areas of New York, in Queens, and some of those other areas where there's just massive disruption in the economy because of COVID and losing your job and not having any prospects, you're not going to be able to refinance. And so I think you will see the foreclosures there, because how long will the lenders wait for you to try to get back on your feet to get a job? And I think they may wait a little while, but of course they're already waiting because of the forbearances. I think that we're going to have a bottleneck of foreclosures, because there's not just about the foreclosures that can be started or will be triggered because of a default after the forbearance, but it's all of those ones that the foreclosures were just about to start and they had to be stopped. So I have a lot of clients that are both in servicing and in title, and they are super concerned about there just being this, bottleneck. And eventually that's going to open up and it's going to spill out, and we're going to at least have some level of foreclosures, and then contested foreclosures and allegations that the servicer didn't do the right forbearance and the right modifications and you did something else wrong about in the process of servicing. And we will have the same type of claims and needed defenses by servicers and lenders, originators, that we saw in 08. But again, I'll just close with saying that I don't think we're going to be at the 08, 09, 010 level of foreclosures.
Loretta?
But I think, yeah, we might be at that level of forbearances. Before we even get to this huge influx of foreclosures, we have to work through loss mitigation and how to get these folks, all the people on forbearance, back on track. And a lot of those people who claim they needed the forbearance, as we've seen in the data, have continued to make their payments, which is reassuring that they had that safety net, but still they're still making payments. And we'll see when the 6 months is up, who re-ups and who's back on their feet. And to both of your points, gentlemen, clearly there are going to be urban areas, especially, that are hit harder by COVID, and not just by the virus, but economically too, and harder for those people to get on their feet. But I think it's going to be the same challenge we always see with loss mitigation and figuring out how to get every consumer through this waterfall. And some people might be able to go out and refi, because not just of the equity in their home, but because they're gainfully employed and they're back on their feet, or they can make something work even if they were at a 15-year to go to a 30-year. So I think it's going to be especially challenging for servicers to get everybody through that loss mit pipeline before they get to foreclosure. And then absolutely there's going to be an influx of work for foreclosure attorneys, for the title folks that support that, and then all the litigators who are going to be ready to thwart and put back all of the possible and novel plaintiffs' claims. It's going to be especially challenging. And then we still are going to have to struggle with the local eviction moratoriums. Even if you are successful in getting through your forbearance or getting through the foreclosure cycle, then are you going to be able to evict folks? And what's that going to look like? Even if there's not a moratorium in place in that particular county or municipality, are you going to be able to be heard in the court? Is there going to be some accelerated means to do that? So I think it's going to be a domino effect through every single element of the life cycle of these loans.
Loretta, you hit on something that I'd like to come back to, and then we'll have Trip jump in as well. We've been talking so far about enforcement and conditions, but you mentioned local moratoriums on foreclosure. Let's take a look at that. Let's talk a little about possibility of new or more laws, more regulations. We have, without making this a political show necessarily, but we have a like-minded Congress, more or less, for the first time in several years. And some, not all, but some believe they will somehow manage to become a little more active in their lawmaking. You've also got 50 state legislatures out there who may be primed to move on things. Do you guys foresee, first and foremost, on the foreclosure issue, do you see that there being some additional wrinkles thrown into the mix there? And then maybe you can go out to the larger view as well. Are we going to see a more active legislative and regulatory role in the coming year?
Well, I think that we will see more care given to consumers' needs, whether it's through Congress or through the GSEs and then states. I think that it's very likely that we'll see local regulation or ordinances or measures to keep folks in their homes, like we've seen for renters. And I expect that these eviction moratoriums might be such that even if it's not a foreclosure moratorium, or if those people are preempted out, which I could see somehow happening, that there still might be some local attention to keep people in their homes in areas that are hardest hit. And there just aren't the resources if all these folks get put out on the street. So I don't know how that would extend to more regulation. I think certainly we're going to see attention to fair servicing, which we've heard threatened for ages and ages and ages. And instead of these kind of fair servicing based on disparate treatment or disparate impact of protected classes, it has always been our fear. Instead, we saw very sweeping regulation of the servicing industry, especially federally, with attention to loss mitigation and making sure that folks aren't getting double tracked, and many consumer protections to keep consumers who are economically harmed, and especially those who have the wherewithal to make some payments in their homes and on track to get back to full performance. So I think that certainly there will be a focus on that and how servicers follow their own waterfalls, and a look at trends in the disparate impact and big data related to how folks work through those servicers' queues and waterfalls.
Interesting. Trip, more active legislatures, more active regulators?
I do not think that you're going to get active legislation, affirmative legislation on these granular issues from Congress. It used the word granular. It's too granular for them. They can pass all the economic relief. That's easy. $2,000 there for everybody, whatever. Moratoriums, big picture items. But from I think that they're looking at big picture economic issues. They're not going to get granular on that, and I quite frankly don't think they need to. I think we have the statutes and regulations in place that Loretta mentioned that provides the guide rails for consumer protection. Do I think, though, that maybe the CFPB revisits some regulations that might be able to be tightened up to help? Maybe, but again, I think that again, Loretta's right that they're going to focus on what they've already been doing, which is sort of the supervisory role, whether it's the CFPB, the OCC, the FDIC. They're going to do more intense supervision to make sure that the guidelines are being followed. That's why they're hiring more people, because I think that's going to be their approach. It's too hard, both at a congressional level and a regulatory level, to get legislation and regulations promulgated and not challenged, and so I think they're going to use what they have, the resources they have available. That would be my guess on that.
Well, thank you, Trip. I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn now here, my friends. We're not doing the mortgage headlines this week, but I did see a story just a couple days ago that I wanted to share and get your reaction on. A gentleman by the name of Bill Tessar, and by the way, this is coming from MPA, Mortgage Professional America, articles by David Katai, and it's dated the 16th of February. So Bill Tessar, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, he's the president of private lending firm Civic Financial Services, which was recently acquired by PacWest Bancorp. And he told MPA that he expects, and I'm quoting here, a winter of death for the mortgage industry. I mean, wow, that's the best term I've heard. Murder hornets. That writes itself. But in all seriousness, go ahead, Loretta.
Kevin's already feeling the winter of death. Poor thing.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, Kevin's enjoying the winter of death. Maybe they'll. Yeah, sorry, I can't talk that. So Mr. Tessar is suggesting, and this is a larger emerging story. I think we're entering in an M&A period here, and again, I'm quoting. He thinks we're entering an era of winners and losers, more aggressive M&A. And then end quote, big players gobbling up medium-sized lenders, and he doesn't think it will all be by choice. He believes at some point some of these mid-sized lenders will start to struggle with the end of the refi boom. Although, Trip, your point about a possibility of yet another little refi spike is well taken. Very interesting point. But he thinks some people are going to struggle with that purchase market, and that they'll be eaten up. I wanted to see Loretta or Trip, and even Kevin, if you want to jump in, who had some thoughts about this coming likely M&A period.
Well, I saw that article, read that article, and I thought it was rather overblown. You can't at one point say all of these people or all of these lenders, and he really means non-depository lenders, are going to go away because when he says a winner of death, merger is not death. Merger is live for another day. And so if he simply means, what's another analogy would be, something that would analogize yourself to one country taking over another country, or one tribe taking over another tribe without killing anybody. per se, just assuming, governance. And if that's what he's talking about, I think he is right, because there certainly was, if the refi boom goes completely away, it's going to have a trickle down effect from lenders to title to settlement service providers to vendors. There's no question, because they've all been living high on the hog, as Kevin mentioned, over the last 18 months or so, if not longer. And if it dies by 50 to 70%, notwithstanding my prior comments, then sure, people weren't going to survive. But if they have sufficient pipelines, although they're not full, where a PE company or another lender, a larger lender, feels like, look, let's capture that market pipeline so that when things come around again, we'll be ready to roll. I think that's going to happen. I would say generally, though, over the last 12 months, the amount of mergers and acquisitions, and I think much more acquisition than merger, though there clearly have been mergers, but acquisitions by, through capital market investment, private equity investment, has been tremendous. In my practice, I went from only doing a little bit of due diligence and transactional work, in my entire career, to over the last 12 to 18 months, it being 50% of my practice, where I'm providing support to the acquiring company in doing due diligence over who they're purchasing, mortgage, title, real estate. It is a little scary knowing that they're spending a tremendous amount of money. The multipliers are ridiculous. That there might be a die down in the market, given that you can only you can refi your house, but the rates are what they are now, and they can't. I don't see them going much lower. But even if they do, it's not terribly economic to do a refi. But they're spending a lot of money to capture that business, and it has not slowed down, and I don't think it will slow down. I think the ball is rolling down, or the snowball is rolling down, and clearly, you start with a small snowball at the beginning of the hill, and it gets super big towards the bottom, and then actually, as it gets to the bottom, it starts to lose snow. It doesn't get bigger. It falls apart by its own weight. And I think that's what you'll see in these acquisitions, is that it'll continue to flow, but once you get to the lower level, things will start to fall apart. And I think what you'll see is sort of the reverse of that in the next year. I think you'll see people shedding portions of their business that they may have recently acquired.
And Loretta, before you go there, Trip, you had to go with the snowball analogy while poor Kevin sits shivering in Texas. Kudos for that. Very nicely done.
There's no snowballs in Texas because there's no hills there. So
they'd argue about that in North Country, I think. But all right, Loretta, what are your thoughts on the whole M&A boom? Are we looking at a winter of death, or maybe something not quite like that?
Well, I guess to use another analogy than the snowball, it's the pendulum, right? Whenever we see the pendulum swing extremely, whether it's toward regulation, so that there's a game-changing regulation, or enforcement, so that the compliance burden heightens for smaller companies, we see that this proliferation of M&A, because players who otherwise wouldn't have considered merging or joining someone else are willing to do it because their burden of compliance is too high. And I think while we did see a ton of activity over the past year, we didn't see a lot of it from our lender clients because they were too busy even to think about it, right? They're keeping their funnels full, and they didn't really have an appetite to join others necessarily. But certainly, I think that with the change in administration, with the increased focus on enforcement, even without an onslaught of new regulations, that might cause a lot of small to medium-sized players to say, you know what, I'm throwing in the towel and I'm going to join with someone else who has more robust platform or technology, or if I can mitigate my risk for some of the buybacks or putbacks on this servicing side because of the potential servicing liability coming down the pike, depending on how they handle CARES forbearance and depending on whether they're what their role is with servicing. So that might be something that we see. Certainly, there's been a huge push for technology in the marketplace, and we see small to medium-sized lenders purchasing technology or entering into contracts, but they really don't have the bandwidth to implement that. And oftentimes they're spending a lot of money on technology they're not really using. And if they can jump into someone else's platform, maybe that would be helpful as well. So it will be interesting to see, but I would expect more. And some of our clients that in the past have had no appetite, small to medium sized lenders, to join some of the bigger fish who've been trying to swallow them up. I've heard them say they're entertaining other types of mergers where they can still retain some control, but step back. So I guess we'll see.
Oh, go ahead, Kurt. Yep.
Also mentioned that we've been talking about either mergers of like kind operations, one lender to another lender, or title company, another title company, or agency or underwriter, keeping it within the family. But I think there's also something that we shouldn't forget about, and that's the purchase by settlement service providers of what Loretta mentioned with this new technology. So the technology's out there. It seems like it's advertised by the tech company as providing some sort of novelty, some sort of streamlining of processes. And if you're a company that is concerned about what's around the corner, and I think most are, even with the boom in the business, I've seen companies, lenders, title companies, buying those technology companies up, or vice versa, because sometimes the tech companies are so cash rich from their PE investors that they're buying and they're combining the two companies so that if there is a downturn, they've got something novel to sell to the market. So I've seen a lot of that, and it still requires a tremendous amount of due diligence on the compliance side. Again, hitting the same issues as I did before, which is cyber issues and just otherwise consumer compliance in terms of the protections that are supposed to be provided. So there's a ton of that, and I think we might see more of that. And just to digress for a second, so I don't forget, I wanted to mention on the servicing side, with respect to the CARES Act and deferment and so forth. There's always movement of mortgage servicing rights from one servicer to another, from one subservicer to another, and it's sort of incestuous. It just flows around. And one of the things that the servicers, I would suggest to the audience, needs to be of particular attention. It's always important when you're selling when you're purchasing the servicing rights, that you're aware of what you're purchasing and where the loans are in the life cycle of the loan. That's always important. Is it in default? Isn't it in default? What discussions have the prior servicer have about modifications? Are you in a modification? All of those things. We've seen tons and tons of litigation and enforcement actions around the inability of the purchaser, when they're onboarding all of these things, to actually have the knowledge they need, the due diligence undertaken, and the knowledge they need on that granular level of loan servicing. It is only going to be and is exasperated and increased because of the deferments. So if you're purchasing loan servicing rights and large portfolios, you got to have some company that can do the due diligence and go in and look at each loan at the granular level to figure out where it falls within this whole CARES Act environment. Because if you don't, I mean, if you're just now looking at stuff you looked at and we knew you need to look at 2 years ago, you're missing a huge chunk of what could be super problematic, let alone buybacks, and other foreclosures, and where you are in that process, and make sure you're not going to dual track somebody. This is huge, right? I just think that is a tremendous, and there are a lot of really great companies out there. Recently, the most recent one I saw was Canopy, and I think that that's an awesome company. It's not a pitch; it's just another one of the many different ones that are out there that can provide, that servicers should be consulting with as they're going through the purchasing of servicing rights.
Well, a lot of interesting points we hit on there, and yeah, Tripp, you may have already given an answer for our final question to you guys, but maybe not with dual tracking. And I will quickly mention, we mentioned a lot about technology there. I know Mr. Grant is rounding up some very interesting tech guests, including possibly Canopy, in the very near future. So we may have to have you back on at that time. But to my panelists, and even to Rick and Kevin, if you want to jump in as well, we've talked about a lot of the major storylines so far in this young year. What's the one storyline that will play out in 2021 that no one's talking about yet?
No, I can't
Well,
say.
we talked a lot about technology. I mean, I think technology and FinCEN, we've seen this trend and regulators looking closely at FinCEN, and we have so many clients that are settlement service providers, but they really think about themselves as tech companies. They're led by hedge funds, and they're new to the mortgage industry, regardless of the service they're providing. And a lot of times they don't know what they don't know. And even when they hire competent professionals, sometimes it's hard to work with them on their educational curve, I guess, based on compliance and all of the things that they need to consider. And so I think that we're going to see more attention there. We've already seen it in the licensing space as to, are they engaging in licensable activities when a lot of times they don't think they are, or they might characterize their services as being one thing when there's something else. And it's because they have novel approaches, they're disruptors, they have people who think outside of the box or don't even know about our mortgage industry box. So they are innovators, and it's awesome. But as Tripp has warned us, and it's true, when they're handling consumer data and there's consumer protection at stake and they're sharing that data, it's going to be more important than ever that those of us who are counseling traditional service providers and those of us who are counseling these tech and FinCEN companies all make sure that everyone is doing their due diligence for all types of compliance and consumer protection issues. And I think we're going to see even more focus on that coming up this year.
I'd agree with that, Loretta. Tripp, what's the big story we're not yet talking about for 2021?
It's very similar to it's sort of the unknown stepchild of what Loretta just mentioned, and that is the movement towards novel underwriting. And I mean that at both the mortgage industry, I mean it in the title industry. Okay, so while obviously they're not exactly the same, you're not looking at the exact same data or not making the exact same decisions. I'm going to use the word underwriting generally for those two. And what you've seen is tech companies coming in and saying, we can provide the underwriting, or we will, as a vendor, or we are the mortgage lender, or we are the agency or title underwriter, and we're going to do underwriting different. We're going to look at unique data points. And why would we want to do that? Because we can streamline the process. We can get more borrowers in the door that we feel comfortable with. We can get more title policies out that we feel comfortable with, but we're not using the old school analytics because that takes too long. It's too expensive sometimes it's too expensive to get into a market, because you have to, like say in a title operations, you need to have access to a title plant in Texas. And so that's sometimes prohibitive for some of the new people, and they don't even know how to use a title plant. So the point being, is that they're going to start pushing the envelope. And what I mean by that is the regulatory envelope. So when you're in a state and they say, well, how do you do your underwriting? What are you using? And you say, I'm going to use AI, and this is the type of stuff. This is the data points that we're looking at, and here's what our algorithm does. And I'm going to tell you, these old school regulators are going to be like, what? No, I don't understand that. And you're not going to use my Billy Bob down the road, and you're not, how are you protecting Sally Smith, as a borrower? You're making sure you're doing, ability to repay and so forth. But that's coming. Okay, it's coming. It's already here, but it's coming. And so it's going to be the tension between these new companies providing this unique underwriting and the old school regulators coming to accept them, right? And I think there's going to be a lot of pushback. I can't exactly see exactly how it's going to be a pushback, but I think that at some point, just like we had recently with remote notary, right? No one, that was a result of, because something had to happen in order to keep the industry going. We won't exactly have that type of impetus for this new underwriting operations, but something's going to have to push that forward so that it can get through the barriers of all of the, whether it's a GSE requirement or it's a HUD requirement or it's a state regulator licensing requirement. They're going to have to push the barriers on that in order, because it's coming. We all know.
Well, it's going to be very interesting to watch this play out. Kevin and Rick, did you want to jump in on that? I love the question. What's the story of 2021 that we're not quite there with yet?
Well, I think for me, after, being in this business for so long and kind of watching what's been going on the last year, go back to the M&A question for a moment. And it appears to me that there are a lot of companies who have decided to go public. They're trying to, create a bigger cash reserve for whatever is next. I believe that from what I've seen and from other companies and that I've talked with, technology, especially AI, is where a lot of this focus is going. They're, without anybody saying it, I think they're trying to get an entire purchase transaction down to 10 days. And the only way you can do that is to eliminate a lot of the steps, bring AI into the picture, and go forward from there. But the thing that concerns me more than anything is that the other part of the M&A question is, how many of these people have built a company, made an incredible amount of money over the last 18 months, and now have decided when they can price this as high as they possibly can, are taking an exit strategy, only for the acquiring company to find themselves in a position of having too much of everything 12 months down the road. And I think that the thing that we have to watch out for as an industry is that what usually happens to us is that we become self-destructive.
Well, very interesting, guys. Rick, did you want to say something there?
The only thing I would say is that I'm looking for a story to come this year about somebody who gets clever about dealing with millennials and home purchasing. We already know that first-time home buyers are having a hard time finding inventory in the market. And even though there are some signs that us old guys are going to die off and leave our homes to them, it's not happening yet. At the same time, we're hearing stories about young people that don't really want to leave the college environment. I'm looking for the story where somebody comes up with a new 1 to 4 multifamily that's designed for young people that gets a lot of attention. I think that'll be an interesting story, and somebody's going to come up with that within the next year or two.
Maybe you make millions.
I'm not smart enough, Loretta.
Well, on that note, Trip and Loretta, if you'll stick around for a minute, we have a regularly recurring segment. Mr. Kevin Breeland would like to know if we're kidding him. Kevin, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brian. So coming from the frozen tundra that is Austin, Texas, there's a couple of things that I also want to point out to everyone. Now, you know that on this show, we try to keep everyone updated on the activities of our favorite billionaires. And I will say that lately it's been kind of quiet. You know, just as an FYI, Elon is now in first place as far as who's the richest guy in America. And I think that's partly because of two things. One is the financial analysts found out that Tesla spent $1.5 billion in Bitcoin. So Elon has his 3 coins in his pocket that he's carrying around. And Jeff spent 165 million on a house. So they just flip-flopped the two guys and said, okay, here you are. But the other thing that I found just enormously disturbing is Elon, because you know, all of us in major metropolitan areas, hot housing markets are suffering from an inventory problem. Houses are selling, you know, my brother lives in Idaho. Houses are selling in the greater Boise area between $50,000 to $100,000 over asking price, which is crazy. But Elon went public to say Austin will now become the biggest boomtown. So I just wanted to tell him thank you ahead of time for overpricing my next house that I have to buy by at least $50,000, just because, you know, he likes to read about himself in the newspaper. And that was the local paper. He didn't go to Forbes or anybody. He went to the local paper and said, you know, get ready, guys. It's going to really get bad. The second thing, and this is kind of, you know, we all kind of need to take a pause because job performance, COVID-19, certain industries that haven't done very well have really created havoc on your individual economy. And by what I mean by individual economy is what you have coming into your own household. And we've seen people that have lost their jobs, that are now working at 50% of what they used to work at, being paid at 50%. And that goes all the way up to the CEO ranks. So here we have a story of 2 bank CEOs, one for Bank of America and another one for Citigroup, that have fallen on some hard economic times. Bank of America cut the pay for their CEO by 7.5% for 2020. He is now only going to make 24.5 million. So, you know, I think that their vacation in the Hamptons for the summer is probably canceled. And Citigroup, you know, they were at one time the largest financial organization in the world, believe it or not. Well, they got even more pissed off for some reason, and they cut their CEO's compensation by 21%, 1/5. And he's only going to make 19 million this year. So when you're over your pot of beans and rice, getting ready to feed your family of 10, keep in mind that these guys are struggling too, and let's keep them in our thought and prayers.
Well, thank you, Kevin. On that note, I think that's all we really have time for today. I would like to thank our very special guests and dear friends, Trip Riley, Loretta Salzano. Will you guys come back and see us again?
Absolutely.
Thanks a bunch. Take care.
Absolutely. And of course, Kevin and Rick, always a pleasure. Kevin, stay warm out there. And I've got to get around to it sometime, I guess. I've got an update here on the iPad. I've got 2 updates on. I've got 4 updates on my iPad. Mr. Grant, help me out here.